They said Georgia's soil was rich because it fed on tears. Every field, every furrow, had been watered by the sorrow of those who had no names worth remembering. On mornings when the fog sat low over the Whitmore lands, the air carried the weight of everything that had been done and everything that had been hidden. It was 1920, but the world on that side of the dirt road still lived in the century before. The war was over, the papers had changed, but not the hearts of men. The Whitmore family stood as proof that old power does not die, it only sleeps with its eyes open. Thomas Whitmore was the youngest of his blood, born into wealth he had not earned and shame he did not understand. His father, Colonel Whitmore, had built the plantation's name on the back of generations who could not speak for themselves. Thomas returned from the city with books and questions, thinking perhaps there was something gentler waiting for him at home. He did not know that gentleness had no place in a house where even the walls remembered the cries of those who had scrubbed them clean. Among the workers was a girl they called Clara Mae. 17 years of age, thin as the edge of a blade, hands scarred from the fields, her wages counted in dimes that barely bought bread. 10 cents a day. 10 cents for her breath, her labor, her silence. They mocked her for her price, not knowing that her worth would one day outlive every one of their names. She had learned early that the world did not love girls like her. But she also knew how to survive in a world built to erase her. The first time Thomas saw her, she was carrying a sack heavier than her body, her bare feet cutting into the dry earth. The overseer struck her for moving too slowly. Thomas did not think, he stepped forward, his hand catching the whip mid-air. No one had ever seen a white man stop another on behalf of a girl like Clara. The moment froze the field. The sun hung still, and for a heartbeat, even the wind refused to move. The overseer spat, the others watched, and Clara lowered her eyes, knowing that mercy often came with a price. That day, the balance of the land shifted. They said it was just a moment, a foolish act of pity from a boy who didn't understand his place. But something quiet began to live between them, something neither of them had words for. It was not love yet. It was recognition, the strange awareness of another soul caught in the same invisible cage. Thomas began to find reasons to walk the fields at dusk, to carry papers to the barn, to check on the harvest long after the others had gone. Clara would be there, her back to him, her voice low, humming songs she wasn't supposed to know. Their eyes met only briefly, but each glance carried a story longer than the Bible verses they were forced to recite. Nights grew heavier. The summer heat made sleep impossible. From his window, Thomas could see the glow of lanterns near the workers' quarters. The plantation looked different after dark, softer, haunted, honest. It was during one of those nights that he followed the sound of her voice to the old barn. He stood outside, listening to her hum an old tune, one she had learned from her mother before the river took her. When she turned and saw him there, she did not scream. She only stared, waiting to see what kind of man he was. He told her he meant no harm, that he wanted to understand, that he could not bear the silence of his house anymore. She said understanding was not for people like him, and silence was safer than truth. But he came again, and again after that, until the sight of him no longer startled her. He brought her pieces of bread, a book, a promise that he would teach her the words inside it. Under the dim light, she traced the letters with her fingers, whispering sounds like secrets. The way she looked at those pages made him ashamed of how easily he had taken his own learning for granted. And somewhere in the stillness between their breaths, something tender began to take root. Days turned into weeks. The overseer began to watch them too closely. The other workers noticed when she smiled at nothing, when he lingered too long. Whispers grew like weeds, carried by mouths too afraid to say the truth out loud. And through it all, Colonel Whitmore sat in his great house, deaf to the rhythm of his own ruin. He believed his son would marry a girl from town, inherit the land, keep the family name clean. He never imagined that love could grow in the dirt he had used to bury others. When the rain came one evening, the thunder rolling over the hills, Clara waited inside the barn, afraid to run home through the storm. Thomas found her there, soaked, trembling, the candlelight flickering against her face. He stepped forward, not as the master's son, not as the man who was supposed to own her, but as someone who no longer knew how to stay away. The world outside vanished for a moment. It was the first time he had ever touched something that did not belong to him, and the last time anything in his life would ever feel pure. After that night, nothing could return to what it had been. She carried the secret inside her, one that would grow heavier with every sunrise. The land noticed before the people did. The whispers became certain. The overseer counted the days. And Thomas began to understand what his act of love would cost. But in that brief window of time, before fear found them, there was peace. They would meet under the same tree where she once prayed alone. They would talk about leaving, though both knew there was nowhere to go. They spoke of cities they would never see, of freedom they could never touch. And though the world around them remained cruel and unmoving, for those few stolen nights, they believed that love could hide from history. They were wrong. Because the past is never still, and the soil of Georgia keeps what it is given. Every secret sinks deep. Every promise turns to root. And beneath the fields of cotton, where the blood had long dried and the bones had long been forgotten, something waited, patient and unforgiving, ready to remind them that no sin on that land ever truly stayed buried. The days that followed moved slower than the rest of the world, as if time itself was afraid to witness what had begun. The nights were their only refuge, and in those hours they learned how to exist beyond the reach of law, beyond the weight of names. Thomas no longer looked like a man who owned anything. He looked like someone trying to unlearn what his blood had taught him. Clara no longer bowed her head when he spoke, she stood taller, her voice steadier, her silence no longer submission but strength. They met when the field slept, when even the wind seemed too tired to stir the leaves. The barn became their world, its walls, their only witnesses. He would bring her bits of bread wrapped in handkerchiefs, pieces of fruit stolen from his father's table, scraps of paper filled with words he thought she should know. Sometimes she would laugh at the strange sounds of the letters, and he would smile at how she turned each one into something sacred. By the light of an old lantern, she learned how to read her own name. The first time she traced it with her finger, she whispered, "If I can name myself, they can't take me away." He did not answer. There was nothing to say. The lessons became excuses to see her, but the words they shared were heavier than the pages of his books. She told him about her mother, about the songs she sang before the river took her. He told her about the city, about lights that burned brighter than stars, about voices that did not tremble when they spoke. Each story brought them closer to a place that did not exist, a small patch of freedom they built out of breath and imagination. But freedom, in Georgia, was a fragile thing. It lived only in shadows and in whispers. He knew it. She knew it. Yet neither could stop reaching for it. Then came the night when the storm rolled in, heavy and restless. Rain fell in sheets, drumming against the tin roof, drowning out the sounds of the world beyond. Clara was inside, huddled near the lantern, her hands trembling from the cold. When he entered, soaked to the bone, the light caught his face, tired, desperate, human. For a moment they stood without words. The air between them held every thought they had never dared to speak. The thunder cracked, and something inside them gave way. There was no plan, no courage, no fear, only the truth of two souls who had been denied everything except each other. After that night, the world around them did not change, but they did. He walked through the house differently, as if every step carried the memory of her breath. She moved through the field slower, her body already whispering what neither of them dared to admit. The mornings made her dizzy, her hands trembled, and the overseer noticed. Whispers began again, quiet, dangerous, certain. Thomas tried to hide his worry behind chores and routine, but the walls had eyes. The servants saw him sneak bread and cloth toward the quarters, the workers saw the way his gaze followed her across the yard. He told himself he could fix it, that he could protect her, that his father would understand once he saw that love was not a crime. But even as he thought it, he knew that in that house, love had always been the most unforgivable sin. Clara's body betrayed them both. The shape of her belly began to show before the winter harvest. She wrapped herself in larger clothes, avoided the eyes of others, prayed in silence that no one would notice. But secrets have a way of showing themselves, and one morning the overseer caught her stumbling near the well, clutching her stomach. His laughter spread across the yard like wildfire. By dusk, everyone knew. That night, Thomas stood before his father, every lie gone from his voice. He said her name. He told the truth. He said the words no one in that house had ever heard Whitmore speak, that he loved her, that she carried his child, that no man would harm her while he still breathed. His father's face turned to stone. The silence that followed was thicker than the air before a storm. The old man's hand trembled as he reached for his cane, not out of weakness but out of rage too heavy to hold. He asked his son if he had lost his mind, if the blood of his family meant nothing, if the world had gone so mad that a Whitmore could claim a slave's child as his own. Thomas said the only madness was pretending that they were not both made of the same earth. That was when the cane struck the floor, the sound echoing through the house like the end of an era. Clara waited outside, the rain beginning again, the smell of it mixing with the fear in her chest. She knew he was fighting for her, but she also knew what men like his father did when the order of things was threatened. She had seen it before, in the stories whispered by women who vanished, in the graves without names that lined the far fields. When Thomas came out, his face was pale, his eyes hollow. He did not tell her what had been said, only that they needed to leave soon, that there would be no safety once the sun rose. She touched his hand, feeling the tremor beneath his skin, and said she would follow wherever he went. He looked at her then, truly looked, as if memorizing her before the world took her away. And in that moment, before the night swallowed them both, they understood what love really was in a place like Georgia. It was not peace. It was not kind. It was defiance, a fragile, fleeting act of rebellion against a history that had never forgiven anyone for wanting to be free. But the fields do not keep secrets for long. The overseer had already spoken to the colonel. The whispers had already turned to plans. And as dawn approached, the land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what it knew would come next. The days that followed moved like a shadow that refused to lift. The plantation carried a silence too heavy for words, the kind that warned of something about to break. Clara no longer walked freely among the others. They said she was sick, but everyone knew she was being kept apart, locked inside the storage room behind the house, where the air was damp and the only light came through a crack in the wall. Thomas was forbidden to see her. The servants whispered that his father had hired men to watch him, to keep him away from her, but at night he still tried. He would stand beneath the window, whispering her name, promising he would take her away, promising that this land would not be their grave. She would answer softly, her voice fragile but steady, telling him to wait until the moon was full, that she believed in him more than she feared the world. When the night finally came, the moon hung like a pale witness above the trees. Thomas took his father's horse, a satchel, and a gun he had never fired. The path to her room was long, the air thick with the smell of rain and earth. He opened the door quietly, his heart pounding not from fear but from the weight of what they were about to do. Clara was waiting, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale but her eyes burning with a strength that made him tremble. She touched his face once, as if to be sure he was real, then followed him out into the dark. They did not make it far. The overseer had been waiting near the barn, his lantern cutting through the fog. He called out their names, his voice full of triumph. Thomas tried to reason, to tell him that no harm was meant, that they were only leaving. The overseer laughed, a sound that made Clara step behind him. He raised his hand toward her, and instinct took over. There was a struggle, a flash, a cry that seemed to tear the air apart. When it ended, the overseer lay still, the lantern shattered beside him, his eyes wide open to nothing. The light flickered once and died. Thomas stood there, breathless, the gun shaking in his hand. He had never meant to kill, only to protect, but in that moment he knew that nothing would ever be the same. Clara touched his arm, whispering his name, but before he could answer, the sound of shouting came from the house. The dogs had been set loose. They ran. Through the fields, through the mud, through the rain that had begun to fall in sheets again. She stumbled, clutching her belly, the pain twisting her body. He tried to carry her, his voice breaking as he told her to hold on, that they were almost there. But her cries grew louder, sharper, until they stopped running and hid beneath the old magnolia tree. The child was coming too soon. She bit her lip to keep from screaming, her hands gripping the earth, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Thomas held her, helpless, whispering prayers he had never believed in. The night stretched endlessly, every second filled with the sound of her pain and the beating of his heart. By dawn, the riders found them. Colonel Whitmore led them himself, his face hard and pale in the light of morning. He told the others to stay back. When he saw the overseer's blood on his son's hands, he knew what had happened. But when he saw the girl lying there, trembling and half-conscious, he faltered. Thomas stood between them, his voice breaking as he said, "If there's a God, he sees her soul is purer than ours." The old man said nothing. The years of pride and cruelty hung between them like smoke, and in that silence, both men saw what they had become. Clara's voice broke the stillness. She called his name once, then again, softer, as if afraid of waking the world. He turned to her, saw the life fading from her eyes, the child slipping into his hands. For a moment there was both life and death in the same breath. She smiled faintly, the corners of her lips trembling, and then she was gone. The wind moved through the trees, slow and mournful, carrying her last breath away. Thomas held the child, silent, the weight of it both miracle and punishment. His father looked down at them, and for the first time, the man who had owned everything seemed smaller than the boy who had lost everything. He reached out, but Thomas turned away. He said no words, only walked past the riders, carrying the child close to his chest, his steps heavy, steady, final. He buried Clara under the magnolia tree, the same place where she had first spoken her dreams aloud. The soil was soft from the rain, and he dug until his hands bled, until the world around him disappeared. When it was done, he laid her there with nothing but a scrap of white cloth and a whisper of her name. He sat beside the grave for a long time, the child asleep against his heart. When the sun began to rise, he stood. The plantation stretched before him, vast and silent, a monument to everything that had been taken and everything that could never be undone. He looked once toward the house where he had been born, then turned away. He walked down the dirt road without looking back, leaving the land that had shaped him and destroyed him in the same breath. Behind him, the magnolia tree stood tall, its branches swaying gently in the morning light, as if trying to hold on to the memory of the girl who had once believed that love could grow even in the hardest soil. And though no one on that land would ever speak her name again, the earth remembered. It always did. Years passed like pages torn from a book no one dared to finish. The world changed its language, its laws, its colors, but not its memory. What had once been the Whitmore plantation was now nothing more than a skeleton of stone and wood, the bones of a story the land itself refused to forget. The fields that had once bent beneath the weight of men and women now lay still, taken back by wild grass and silence. The house stood half-collapsed, its windows hollow, its doors hanging like open mouths that had run out of words. A young man walked slowly through the ruins. His skin carried the warmth of two worlds, his eyes the same gray as the Georgia sky before a storm. The locals did not know his name, only that he came every few years, that he stood among the magnolias and spoke to no one. He moved with the quiet assurance of someone who had followed a story all his life and finally reached its ending. He stopped beneath the great magnolia tree, now older, thicker, its roots deep enough to touch the bones of another time. Beneath it lay a single stone with no name, only the faint carving of a letter too weathered to read. He knelt and placed his hand on the soil, as though listening. The wind answered softly, moving through the branches, carrying a scent of rain and memory. In his coat pocket was a folded piece of paper, edges frayed, words faded. It had been written in a hand he barely remembered, a voice he had never heard but somehow knew. He unfolded it carefully, his lips moving as he read the lines that had waited decades to be spoken aloud. Love is not sin, but the world that judges it is. Do not let their shame become yours. Live where the earth does not remember chains, where names are not weighed by color, where truth can walk unafraid. He stood there for a long while, the letter trembling in his hand, the air around him heavy with all that had come before. The light dimmed as clouds gathered, but he did not move. The past was still there, but so was he, a living answer to a forbidden prayer. When the first drops of rain began to fall, he turned away, his figure slowly fading into the distance, swallowed by the gray horizon. The land remained silent once more, holding its secrets close, but somewhere within that quiet, the echo of a promise lingered, a reminder that even the cruelest soil can remember love. If this story has touched you, if its truth still hums beneath your skin, let it breathe beyond this moment. Subscribe to the voice that keeps history alive, share the tale so it is not forgotten, and let others know that every buried name deserves to be spoken again.